Okay, hi Professor. Sorry if the quality is not great. I'm recording on my phone here, but so I'm doing my project on the Chilean reconciliation effort in post-Pinochet Chile. Um, so prior to Pinochet's rule in 1970, a man known as Salvador Allende was democratically elected in Chile, and Salvador Allende is notoriously known as the first Marxist leader who was ever democratically elected in global history. He's known for his plan known as La Vía Chilena al Socialismo, which is basically his plan to nationalize industries such as copper and mining industries and banking industries. Um, he really wanted to bring a lot of social welfare to Chile's rural citizens. There is a huge income divide between people living in cities like Arica and Santiago and Viña del Mar compared to people living in rural farmlands. So he wanted to shrink that gap. And by doing this, he wanted to send a lot of children to school. He believed that education was the key in improving relations. You can see here in this picture, this is Allende with a school child. He had a plan, or he instituted a plan where every child going to school would be given some milk, since not everyone would have food. So every school child at school would have something in their belly. And the picture above here is Salvador Allende with notorious communist leader Fidel Castro, who was the leader of Cuba. And this is a really famous picture, just the fact that Fidel Castro was touring in Chile, which is very anti-American, but Chile supported this idea of communism, the idea of this collective unit of nationalization. And in that, he also wanted to provide scholarships for Mapuche children. I mean, this is an indigenous group in Chile, and he believed that they have the right to education as well. So he served for 3 years, and in 1973, there was a military coup led by General Augusto Pinochet, which attacked the capital. This is the Capitol building in Santiago, Chile. And you can see here soldiers on the outskirts. There was mayhem going on. It was like a war zone. And inside the whole time is Allende in the presidential suite. And when he discovered that they had no chance of surviving this coup, he went on the national radio and he said the following to the Chilean people: "Workers of my country, I have faith in Chile and its destiny. Over time, men will overcome this dark and bitter moment when treason seeks to prevail. Keep in mind that much, much sooner than later, the great avenues will again be opened through which will pass free men to construct a better society. Long live Chile, long live the people, long live the workers." And shortly after this speech, Allende committed suicide in the presidential suite. So during his first few years, Pinochet seized power after Allende committed suicide. And during his first few years, he was known for his economic policies. He was completely anti-communism, and he was just pro-free market. So this picture here is known as the Chicago Boys, which is basically what led the economic surge under Pinochet. This is a group of economists that studied in Chicago under the teachings of Milton Friedman. And basically they brought back this system of free markets to Chile. And they opened up all the markets. They seriously lowered the inflation rates through this from the time of Allende's nationalist policies. They had a seriously high number of copper, wine, fruit, and salmon exports, which are fueling the economy and still continue to fuel the economy. And they also privatized many industries, such as highways and banking and just basically everything, as opposed to Allende's nationalized industries. And all this resulted in a 76 to 79 major economic boom. And after this economic boom, which many people attributed to Pinochet's economic policies, 75% of the Chilean electorate said they approved of Pinochet's presidency. And it's important to state that this number 75, it's hard to know how much of that is out of fear and how unbiased the spectrum was when they were taking this poll. But it's still a remarkably high number for someone that seized power. Unfortunately, Pinochet was also notorious for a series of very atrocious human rights violations. And during his time, the amount of the human rights violations, no one exactly knew what was going on when he was in power. It came to light later on, and we'll get to that. But like I said, he was a dictator for 17 years, from 73 to 90. And during this time, there was just numerous kidnappings, cases of torture, and mass death and executions that happened. And a lot of this is the political opponents or leftist-leaning people that voiced opinions that did not align with Pinochet's policies. And during the dictatorship, like I said, the exact number of victims was unknown. And a series of really symbolic national places in Chile were turned into detention and torture centers. And three of the big ones are known as Villa Grimaldi. And Villa Grimaldi is this estate outside of Santiago. It's just this massive compound that can house like thousands of people. Basically, it has all these rooms everywhere. It's this huge area, and under Pinochet, it got turned into the largest torture and detention center. And I believe that there was over 5,000 political prisoners that passed through the torture cells at one point through Villa Grimaldi. The second place is the Estadio Nacional del Chile. And this is the national soccer stadium. So as you can imagine, this is a place of national pride. And then it got turned into this holding place of torture and death and destruction for political prisoners. And the third place is La Esmeralda. This is a four-masted Navy ship that's just is like the staple of Chile's Navy. It symbolizes their power and their strength. And this also got turned into a detention and torture center off the shore of Chile, the shore of Valparaiso. And people were held on the ship and tortured out there and held for information. Here we can see three pictures. This is Villa Grimaldi. It doesn't do it justice, but it's just this huge complex where people went through. This is the Estadio Nacional del Chile. This is the soccer stadium, and as you can see, soldiers are up here. This is during the time. You can see political prisoners over here. Everyone's crowded in. And this is La Esmeralda. And the ship is still currently in use. It sails around the world, and it's actually very controversial because of the tortures that happened there. But you can see it's just this massive ship where like a lot of political prisoners were held. So, in 1989, Pinochet permitted a referendum in which 55% of the electorate, after 16 years of rule, voted that they wanted new leadership in Chile. And this resulted in a democratic election in 1990 in which Patricio Aylwin democratically won. And this is, for the first time in 20 years, they again had a democratic election. So this is the return of a major project known as democracy. And with Aylwin brought a second project of reconciliation. Aylwin ran on a campaign platform of creating truth and justice for the victims, establishing what happened, and trying to move Chile forward in a unified front, which is obviously no easy task. Only 1 month into his presidency, Aylwin created the Chilean Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also known as the Rettig Report. And the commission was split it was made up of 8 people, and it was split between left and right-leaning liberals and conservatives. So there was a split in ideology on the panel, and they were aided by a staff of 60. The main goals of the panel was to identify the victims, identify what happened, recommend reparations for the victims or families of victims, and suggest legal framework to prevent future human rights atrocities and future attacks on the Chilean democracy. So, the report spanned over a series of around 9 months, and its findings concluded that from 1974 to 77, that's when the majority of abductions, torture, and murders took place. The report found that 3,428 cases resulted in death, and to this day, the Chilean government still pays reparations around $16 annually, $16 million US dollars annually to the families of victims that perished under Pinochet. And there's been some serious criticism of this report as well. Pinochet and his administration could not be persecuted due to prior amnesty laws, which were created under his dictatorship. And because Pinochet, even when he lost the election in 1990, he was still very powerful in the electorate. I mean, not the electorate, he's very powerful in the judicial system, very powerful in the military, and had a lot of influence over the Senate. And the amnesty law couldn't be changed without the Senate voting it. And he had so much influence there that he prevented his own persecution. On the left side, there's a lot of critiques that the Rettig report, it only focused on cases that resulted in death. So there was just thousands and thousands of cases where maybe a political prisoner survived torture after many years, but they didn't die. Therefore, they received no reparations, and their family received no reparations. And there's also cases where people are stuck in limbo, where people went missing and they don't know where they are, presumed to be dead, but they haven't found the body or proven the case resulted in death. And these have resulted in families receiving no reparations, which is also very controversial. So the number up here, 3,428, is only for cases that resulted in death. and the families received the reparations, which is the 16 million here. Yeah, and this is just a picture here of Aylwin and Pinochet shaking hands, so you can see the democratic transition of power happening in 1990. So the aftermath of the report, Aylwin and the government unanimously approved the decision of the report. They approved all the material inside the report. Aylwin went on live TV and made a very emotional national apology to the Chilean people, which is one of the most famous apologies in reconciliation history. We're going to watch a brief clip here. I'm sorry, my computer is just old and slow. So it has English subtitles. Keep in mind that the new line of subtitle will start at the bottom, and then when another line comes up, the old line will go up. It's a little confusing, so just look at the bottom line first, and the older bottom line will go up.
Es la sociedad chilena la que está en deuda con las víctimas de las violaciones de derechos humanos.
And this is the apology.
Patricio Aylwin asume esta noche una responsabilidad histórica que conmueve a millones de chilenos.
Por eso es que yo me atrevo, en mi calidad de presidente de la República, a asumir la representación de la nación entera para en su nombre pedir perdón a los familiares de las víctimas. Por eso también pido solemnemente a las Fuerzas Armadas y de Orden y a todos los que hayan tenido participación en los excesos cometidos que hagan gestos de reconocimiento del dolor causado y colaboren para minorarlo. No me arrepiento y creo que fue...
So, as you can see, it was a really emotional moment, and that was on national television. So unfortunately, after this apology and after the report was produced, there was a series of leftist attacks on conservative politicians that were still supporting Pinochet. And 6 months after conservative politician Jaime Guzman was assassinated, who is right up here, you can see he was a young, prominent conservative politician. Aylwin declared the period of reconciliation over. So these violent attacks really overshadowed the national reconciliation efforts that were born from the Red TV report and likely to continue, but these violent attacks put a halt to that. So after Aylwin and the Chilean government declared that reconciliation is over, you can imagine that there's still people that are missing their loved ones. There's thousands of people that don't know what happened to their loved ones. So the roots of reconciliation really kind of shifted to the Chilean people. And through this, there was a lot of creation of memorial sites. We talked about Villa Grimaldi earlier, which was the estate on the outskirts of Santiago. In an earthquake at the end of Pinochet's rule, the estate largely got destroyed. And afterwards, after Pinochet, it has been turned into a park called Peace Park. And you can see plaques here, which have the names of the victims that passed through Villa Grimaldi, the known victims that passed through Villa Grimaldi. And you can see a painting here as well. It's supposed to resemble a very tranquil area that it's supposed to alleviate sorrow and resemble reconciliation. And it's been a very controversial park because there's the idea of creating these really hard remembrances of torture and abductions and murder is never something easy to memorialize. But through that, they've been able, through Peace Park and memorial sites like this, to keep what happened under Pinochet, the human rights atrocities, present. And by remembering these really hard truths, you're going to prevent something like that, or at least that's the idea in the future. So that's why these were created, and they've created a lot of division in the current reconciliation process, but they've helped move the process forward in the fact that they're helping cement Pinochet's human rights atrocities in history as a terrible thing that should never be repeated. And there's giant X's in the site that resemble places where torture occurred or death occurred. And like I said, there is a divide among Chileans currently. In 2006, Pinochet passed away. He had previously been under persecution from the Spanish government. They wanted to extradite him. He was arrested in Britain, and Spain wanted to extradite him because of the torture of Spanish citizens under his dictatorship. He was then sent to Chile, and he was put on trial. But soon after, in around 2004, he was released from trial due to his deteriorating health. And in 2006, as I said, he passed away. On the day that he passed away, around 60,000 civilians showed up in the streets of Santiago to mourn his death and mourn the person that he was, which I think is in itself an extremely large number, and it says a lot about the people that didn't support Pinochet and what he did, but did support his economic policies and the fact that he, as some people would put it, rescued Chile from communism or socialism. So I think as time has progressed, Pinochet is there is a collective memory that establishes that the human rights atrocities and the violations did happen, and it has happened, but there is still a split divide in opinion among Chileans over whether Pinochet was a necessary evil and that he saved the country from communism and he brought them back on economic track to be a successful first world country. However, I mean, there's outraged victims, their families, social human rights activists, and left-leaning voters that routinely protest on December 11th against the military coup that happened in 1973. So there's this, I mean, I would say the vast majority of Chileans, moderate and left-leaning, and some conservatives as well, agree that no matter how good economic policies were, there's no excuse to abduct people off the street, create torture, and create fear and death, and make just do awful things to these people, many of whom are still missing and thousands of whom were murdered. And that's no excuse. That's no excuse for a solid economic policy. So that's where the left side is coming from here. Yeah, and like I said, there's this split that's still there, but I would say that it's leaning more and more towards the left as we go along through history. Here we see some really emotional images. Our top left here, these are all faces of people that are still missing. Their cases were never resolved, and these are, I assume, to be loved ones, and they're protesting in the streets of some of the major cities of Valparaiso, Arica, Santiago, and yeah, this happens all the time in Chile, where they show faces of people that were never figured out or what happened to them. And right beneath it, you can see these youthful people which are holding pictures of Pinochet in celebration. And they're saying that he has saved Chile. As you can see, this woman up here, this is taken at the time of just after he passed away. This is a picture of Pinochet saying, "Gracias, thank you." And underneath, Salvador Allende, these are people that are in opposition to Pinochet that are trying to memorialize Salvador Allende and his socialist policies and saying that he resembles democracy and social well-being and harmony, and the death of him by Pinochet was an awful, atrocious thing that happened. Yeah, as you can see, there's still this major split divide that's happening within the country. In the current stage of reconciliation, I would say that Chile is in restitution. More specifically, they're in backward restitution. Families of people that were murdered are receiving compensation, but other than that, there hasn't been much forward restitution efforts. In 2004, the National Commission on Political Imprisonment and Torture published a report, which this commission was created out of the Rettig report, that there was around 35 cases of torture that occurred under Pinochet's dictatorship, which has further cemented the idea that Pinochet, what he did was just atrocious and there's no excuse for it. And it's also further separated the really far-leaning right, who say that no matter what Pinochet did, it was necessary, from the rest of the country, who say that there's no excuse for torture and mass execution. The current divide in Chile is it's prevented the final stage of reconciliation known as oblivion. However, I would say that Chile has grown from thin to thick in the form that they have tried to achieve forgiveness as opposed to vengeance. There has been attacks like the murder of Jaime Guzman, like I said, but in the grand perspective of the past 40 years of history, they have been thickening the reconciliation and moving towards forgiveness and building a joint narrative. But like I said, there still is this divide. So hopefully in another generation or two, they can fully move past this stage of atrocity and come together as a nation. And that's the end of my slides here, but I'd also like to add that on the world stage, Chile has been very influential in reconciliation efforts. Just after Aylwin was elected in 1990, 4 years later, in 1994, the ANC was elected in South Africa, and they also wanted to create a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they asked a series of leaders from around the world to come and speak, and one of the keynote speakers was Aylwin in the second gathering that they had. And I think what the Chilean delegates who were at these commission, they helped establish this idea that reconciliation should really be formed out of reparations and truth seeking and helping the families of victims and the victims themselves as opposed to sheer vengeance. And because of that, South Africa helped pass laws that prevented the persecution of apartheid-based government officials. And they helped move towards forgiveness as opposed to vengeance, which I think Chile had a very major role in that. So yeah, I mean, they've done a lot of good things in the world reconciliation stage. They've obviously had their own hiccups through the way, and no report or leader can solve reconciliation, but over time they have been thickening. And that's all I have. Thank you so much. Thanks for a great quarter.